I think it's a bit of spiritual gaslighting that can happen when people basically say, if you don't agree with me, you have mental problems or you have some kind of a spiritual immaturity or a block in your spiritual life that you need to get past. I want to draw
Yeah.
attention to something here. Um, I've read, I've read Richard Rohr a bit. I've read a bunch of his blog posts, watched quite a few videos, and I just want to draw attention to a tactic that I see him use quite often. So, and this is to help people who are listening to this. This is to help you guys as you read some of this stuff to just be aware of some of the tactics that are being used. I noticed in what you just read, he said, a mature version of Christianity looks like XYZ.
Mm.
There's often this sort of characterization that if you don't agree with him, you are less spiritually mature. And, I think the progressive Christian movement does this as a whole. If you don't come to the same theological conclusions that they have, you just haven't come along far enough in your faith. I've heard Richard Rohr say things like, there's this thing that happens late in life for the people who are truly enlightened and truly spiritual mature, where you begin to realize these things. You have this consciousness shift happen with maturity. So essentially the implication there is if you haven't come to those conclusions, you are less spiritually mature. I'm looking right now at a blog post where he talks about the idea of God doling out punishment. If you have the idea that God has punishment for sin or rewards for righteousness or things like that, he says this is a cheap image of God. In fact, he says people who believe this is a direct quote, he says they need deep healing because they are attached to the punitive notion of God. It's hard to let go. He even says this, if you're listening to this and you believe that God punishes sin, he says, according to Richard Rohr, that gives a kind of sick coherence to your world. So not only are you spiritually immature if you believe that, if you haven't come to the same conclusions that he has, you're actually in need of deep healing. You have this kind of sick coherence to your world coming from these notions. And even when he talks about believing in hell, down here at the bottom, I think he says, well, now I've lost what he says, but he basically is saying, like, if you haven't come to this idea of non-dualistic thinking, which is what he thinks the way he thinks you should either think dualistically or not dualistically, which by his definition is dualistic thinking. So, do with that what you want. But he's basically saying that you have like like emotional problems that need healing if you don't. So that's just a tactic to be aware of. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to compare that to gaslighting. Gaslighting is when maybe an abused woman confronts her abuser and the abuser makes her feel like she's the crazy one, like she's the one who has the problems. And so I think it's a bit of spiritual gaslighting that can happen when people basically say, if you don't agree with me, you have mental problems or you have some kind of a spiritual immaturity or a block in your spiritual life that you need to get past. So I just wanted to point that out because I noticed that in the passage that you read
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, and I would almost break it down into 2 categories. Like, I would if someone were to say, "Hey, you know, Steve, the reason you're not reformed is because, there's still a measure of sanctification that needs to happen before you can see the doctrines of grace," or something. I mean, could theology be something we grow in as we mature spiritually? Yes. Does it mature toward the 5 points? That's debatable. But the point is, you can have spiritual maturity develop in you. But he's making character judgments that, in my opinion, are out of bounds.